Here is the prescription, and it sounds reasonable enough that you could see yourself agreeing to it. A country has borrowed too much. Its deficit is too large, its debt is climbing, and the bond markets are getting nervous. So it does what any household would do when it's overspending. It cuts back. Less government spending. Higher taxes. Balance the books, restore confidence, and growth will follow. That's austerity. And on paper, it's just fiscal discipline. The same medicine anyone would prescribe themselves after a few too many overdrawn months. But here's the thing. A country is not a household. When a household cuts spending, its neighbors' incomes are unaffected. When a government cuts spending, it is cutting someone else's income directly, a teacher's salary, a contractor's invoice, a pensioner's check, and that person in turn spends less at the shops down the street. The economy doesn't just hold still while the government tightens its belt. It shrinks. And when the economy shrinks, the debt-to-GDP ratio, the very thing austerity was supposed to fix, can get worse, not better, because you've cut the bottom number faster than the top one. This episode is about what happened when a continent ran that experiment for real, at scale, on actual people. And about the moment, mid-experiment, when the institution running it admitted, in writing, that its own math was wrong. The prescription and the math. The theoretical case for austerity has a name serious enough to sound reassuring. Expansionary fiscal contraction. The idea most associated with economists Alberto Aleixina and Silvia Ardagna is that cutting government spending can, under the right conditions, actually boost growth, because it signals fiscal responsibility, lowers borrowing costs, and frees up private investment that would otherwise be crowded out by government borrowing. Footnote 1. It's a real argument made by real economists, and it found a very receptive audience in European finance ministries after 2010, when sovereign bond yields were spiking and confidence was the scarcest resource in the room. The number that determines whether this works is called the fiscal multiplier, the answer to the question, for every euro a government cuts from spending, how much does GDP shrink? If the multiplier is small, say 0.5, cutting a euro of spending only costs the economy 50 cents of output, and austerity is close to a free lunch. If the multiplier is large, above 1, cutting a euro of spending costs the economy more than a euro of output, and the whole strategy can become self-defeating. You cut spending to shrink the deficit, but the economy shrinks faster than the deficit does, and your debt-to-GDP ratio, the thing you were trying to fix, gets worse. Going into the Eurozone crisis, the IMF's working assumption was that the multiplier was small, around 0.5. Footnote 2. That assumption was baked into every forecast, every bailout program, every set of conditions attached to every loan. Then, in October 2012, in a technical box buried in that quarter's World Economic Outlook, the IMF's own research staff quietly noted something was off. Growth forecasts across austerity-implementing countries had been consistently, substantially wrong, and wrong in one direction. Footnote 3. 3 months later, in January 2013, IMF chief economist Olivier Blanchard and co-author Daniel Lee published the full analysis under a title that undersells its own explosiveness: Growth Forecast Errors and Fiscal Multipliers. Their finding: multipliers during the crisis had actually been running somewhere around 0.9 to 1.7. Up to 3 times higher than what the fund had assumed when designing the programs. Footnote 4. The press called it, without much exaggeration, an amazing mea culpa. Footnote 5. Translate that into plain terms. The IMF had spent years telling countries that austerity would cost them at most 50 cents of GDP for every euro cut. The real number in many cases was closer to a euro for euro trade or worse. Which means the programs weren't just painful. They were built on a miscalibrated instrument, applied to real economies in real time with no way to recalibrate mid-flight. 2 countries, 2 experiments. Greece is where this episode has to start because Greece is the case the entire debate gets measured against. Between 2010 and 2015, Greece implemented one of the most severe fiscal consolidations any advanced economy has undergone in peacetime. The result: GDP contracted for 6 consecutive years, a cumulative fall of roughly 25%, a decline on the scale of the Great Depression, compressed into a democracy with a functioning stock exchange and an outstanding loan to the IMF. Footnote 6. Unemployment rose from 9.6% in 2009 to a peak of 27.5% in September 2013. Youth unemployment peaked even higher at 58.2%. Meaning for a period most young Greek adults looking for work could not find any. Footnote 7. This series established in Episode 5 that Greece's debt-to-GDP ratio rose from 127% to 181% during the very program designed to bring it down. Footnote 8. The denominator collapsed faster than the numerator did. Every door has a locked room behind it, and in Greece's case the room was a country that did everything it was told and still ended up owing more. Now the contrasting case, because the series owes the argument its full complexity: Ireland. Ireland ran its own brutal consolidation starting in 2009, roughly €20 billion in spending cuts and €12 billion in tax increases, about 20% of GDP, alongside a bailout and a painful bank recapitalization. Footnote 9. And Ireland's economy did recover, exiting its bailout program in 2013 and returning to headline growth. 4 years, Ireland was held up across European finance ministries as the proof that austerity, done correctly, works. Here's the human-scale reframe for why that story deserves real scrutiny. In 2015, Irish GDP grew by 26% in a single year, a number so implausible for a developed economy that economist Paul Krugman labeled it leprechaun economics on the spot. Footnote 10. The real driver wasn't domestic austerity finally paying off. It was a handful of large multinational corporations relocating balance sheets and intellectual property into Ireland's favorable tax structure, inflating the GDP figure without a corresponding change in the lived economic conditions of Irish households. Economist Stephen Kinsella's preferred description of Ireland's experience isn't poster child. It's beautiful freak, an outcome shaped by a uniquely open, export-oriented, low corporate tax economy sitting next to the world's largest single market. Conditions that simply do not transfer to Greece or Portugal or Spain. Footnote 11. Two countries. Broadly similar prescriptions. Wildly different outcomes, and the difference had almost nothing to do with how faithfully either country followed the austerity playbook. Why the prescription keeps getting written. If the empirical record is this damning, and even the institution writing the prescriptions admitted in its own working papers that its core assumption was wrong by up to 3 times. Why does austerity remain the default response to sovereign debt distress? Option 1. Switch to fiscal stimulus instead, spend your way out of a debt crisis. Dismissed almost immediately by bond markets, which tend to punish rising deficits with higher borrowing costs precisely when a country can least afford them, creating exactly the kind of self-reinforcing crisis austerity is meant to prevent in the first place. Option 2. Debt restructuring. Write down what's owed, spread the pain to creditors instead of citizens. This actually happened in Greece in March 2012, in the largest sovereign debt restructuring in history. Footnote 12. It helped. It also came late, after years of austerity had already been imposed, and it required private bondholders, mostly European banks, to accept losses they had spent 2 years lobbying furiously to avoid. Option 3. Just wait it out, let growth eventually outpace the debt. Requires exactly the growth that austerity, per the IMF's own revised multiplier math, actively suppresses in the short run. The strategy undermines its own precondition. Every door has a locked room behind it. Here's the room. Sovereign bailout money doesn't come from a neutral, disinterested source. It comes from other governments' taxpayers and from private creditors, largely European banks in Greece's case, who have every incentive to see their loans repaid and very little incentive to absorb losses voluntarily. Austerity conditions aren't just a technocratic best guess about growth theory. They are, functionally, a mechanism for prioritizing creditor repayment over the borrowing country's economic output, even when the borrowing country's economic output is the thing that ultimately determines whether the loan gets repaid at all. The Blanchard-Lee paper wasn't a policy failure that got quietly corrected. It was a design feature that got accidentally exposed. The politics that outlived the economics. Austerity's costs didn't stay contained to GDP charts and unemployment statistics. They became political facts with their own momentum. Political economist Mark Blythe, whose 2013 book on the subject remains the field's sharpest single indictment, frames the entire episode as a historic sleight of hand. A crisis that began in the private banking sector, reckless lending, undercapitalized institutions, was, over the space of about 2 years, successfully rebranded as a crisis of public overspending, with the bill transferred from the banks that caused it to the citizens who didn't. Footnote 13. Greece's civil service and pension obligations were real and did need reform. But the debt that actually broke Greece's back in 2009 and 2010 was compounded, not caused, by a banking crisis that originated far outside Greek borders. The political fallout has outlasted the economic debate. Across the austerity program countries, Greece, Portugal, Cyprus, and to a lesser extent Ireland and Spain, the years of fiscal consolidation coincided with measurable declines in trust in national governments and European institutions alike, and with the electoral rise of parties on both the populist left and populist right that built their entire platform around rejecting the technocratic consensus that produced the programs in the first place. Footnote 14. You cannot run a 15-year natural experiment in "the people bear the cost while the institutions design the cure," without that cost eventually showing up somewhere other than a spreadsheet. Which is where this series is headed next. Austerity was one of the two tools available to a country that cannot grow or borrow its way out of debt. There is exactly one lever left standing after that: let the currency absorb the pain instead of the population. It has its own name, its own history, and its own very different set of winners and losers. Here's the plain version. Austerity was sold as fiscal discipline, the responsible choice, the adult in the room. The evidence, including the evidence its own architects eventually produced, says it was closer to a miscalibrated experiment, run on real economies, that shrank GDP faster than it shrank debt in the country where it was applied most aggressively, while the country held up as its success story succeeded for reasons that had very little to do with austerity at all. The bill from 2010 to 2015 didn't just come due in euros. It came due in trust, and that bill is still being paid. Next time, when raising rates and cutting spending both run out of road, there is only one lever left. It's silent, it's currency-based, and, unlike austerity, everyone gets to pull it at the same time. Which is exactly the problem.